time. So I'm Carol Ranking, co-president of the Edwardsville League. And so I welcome all of you here, and we have some visitors. I'm pleased that they could join us. Just a few announcements. For our October meeting, we're planning to continue our series on restorative justice. We're planning a meeting about the Veterans Court here in Madison County. And I would like to remind all of us, including me, to fill out the membership survey and to return our dues notices. Okay, mine's on my dining room table waiting to go into the mailbox. So, okay, I am really pleased to welcome Dr. Kenneth Moffett, who's the chair of the political science department at SIUE. And he teaches a course on the Congress, and he's given up one of his evenings to talk with us about the filibuster. That is a very timely topic, and one that we probably don't have a great deal of understanding about. So I'll turn the meeting over to Dr. Moffett. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and thank you, Carol, very much for the kind introduction. And thank all of you for having me here tonight to talk about the filibuster. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through a presentation, and I timed it out at around 25, 30 minutes or so, and then leave the remainder of the time for questions, answers as far as things go related to the filibuster. And what I'm going to do is go ahead, share my screen, and get some PowerPoint slides up. And if afterward anybody would like the PowerPoint slides or anything like that that I showed, just reach out, let me know, and I'll be happy to provide those to you. And so with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and then go ahead and begin. All right, so tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to everybody a little bit about the filibuster, the history of the filibuster, the way it's been used, and some of the implications of that procedure. And so I want to start off by talking a little bit about some misconceptions about the filibuster, because there's a lot of ideas out there about this procedure that have varying levels of truth or untruth associated with them. And then I'll talk about the filibuster itself and its history.
Hold up.
Okay. And then what I'll do is I'll talk about the way in which the filibuster has been used, as well as some implications of the filibuster in reform proposals. And I know that the League of Women Voters has articulated a couple different statements about the filibuster and the group's position on it, as well as some of the reform options. And so this talk about some of the implications is with an eye towards some of those statements. And so with that, let's talk about some misconceptions. So these misconceptions are subjects of a lot of conventional wisdom that's not really supported when you actually take a look at the evidence. And so one of the things that is put out there about the filibuster, that's the conventional wisdom, so to speak, is that supermajority requirements and unlimited debate were envisioned and preferred by senators from the very beginning. And so, if you will, it's this idea that a higher bar than a majority to pass a bill, as well as unlimited debate on a bill, what was envisioned from the very beginning. But when you look at the constitutional record about the filibuster, neither one of those were necessary features of the Senate. And you go all the way back to the debates of the framers of the Constitution at the time. So what were the framers' primary concerns? One of their concerns was that the Senate would be used to cool popular passions. And so, for example, here you compare the Senate and the House. So the senators have 6-year terms, whereas House members have 2-year terms. And also with House members, they all go up for re-election at the same time. Whereas with senators, that's not so much. In addition, a primary concern of the framers at the time was that the Senate would be set up to represent state governments. And that the Senate, in its original design, was not set up to necessarily represent individuals per se. In addition, another concern was the small state, large state fight that existed at the Constitutional Convention that almost broke up the Constitutional Convention. And so part of the design was the Senate was a way by which to represent states with smaller populations relative to those with larger populations. And also longer terms of office. So 6 years for senators, 2 years for House members. And also you have staggered terms of office, where a third of the Senate goes up for re-election every 2 years. Also, if you take a look at the Federalist Papers argued that the rights of numeric minorities were protected by a system of separation of powers and checks and balances. And so when we look at, say, the filibuster conventional wisdom, in light of what the actual record says, the actual record's a little bit different here. And so what the framers argued was that there was little need for procedural protections given, say, separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, there is a wide-standing debate among scholars about whether separation of powers and checks and balances constitute sufficient protections for minority rights. And the general consensus on that debate is probably not. And so let's talk about some other misconceptions. Another misconception is that institutional commitments to free speech best account for the continued existence of rules that historically protect extended debate. And so, if you will, it's this idea that the Senate was always committed to free speech, and that because of this really strong commitment to free speech, you'd protect extended debate. But the reality is this, that at different times and for different reasons, senators and Senate leaders have actually wanted rules to limit debate. And periodically, Senate minorities thwarted senators who wanted rules that limited debate. So if you will, numeric minorities in the Senate thwarted majorities who wanted rules to limit debate. Also, another set of conventional wisdom. Few measures with presidential support and support from majorities in both chambers have been killed by the filibuster. And so it's this idea that, yeah, you have a supermajority requirement, but at the same time, it doesn't really do any harm, so to speak. And that's not the empirical reality. Because about 58% of filibusters from 1901 to 2004 were done to kill a bill. Another slightly more than 26% of filibusters were done to get a bill amended. And so the fact is, with the filibusters have been used most frequently by far to prevent a bill from passing, with another additional percentage of them that were done to get a bill amended. Another thing that's put out there is that if you have supermajority requirements, that ensures more moderate public policy. And the fact is that simply isn't so. That with supermajority requirements, and I'll revisit this toward the back end of my talk here. So let's say, for example, you have the current Senate with cloture, in other words, the vote to limit debate on a bill before a vote takes place. Let's say you set that at 60, where it currently is today. So if it's set at 60, that means you have to have 60 senators agree to limit debate. And so as such, you look at where that 60th member might lie. That 60th member could be really conservative or could be really liberal, depending on the ideological distribution here. So a supermajority requirement doesn't at all make sure that there's more moderate public policy here. Another bit of conventional wisdom is that a majority of the Senate has opposed rules that weaken the right of extended debate. And the reality is that sometimes that's occurred, but at other times, the majority of the Senate has voted to limit the right of extended debate. And we're going to talk about some of that once we get to the history of the filibuster procedure. So the filibuster's been around since the 1800s. And the filibuster actually came into existence as a little bit of a historical oversight, and some would call a historical accident, if you will. So we go all the way back to 1806 and Aaron Burr. And in 1806, the Senate did not have a rule that empowered a majority to cut off debate. And so initially, and because the Senate didn't have that rule to cut off debate, you could have had a lot of filibusters. But actually, before the Civil War, there were very few of them, because the Senate operated based on majority rule with an expectation that measures would actually get a vote. And so the Senate didn't operate with this expectation that you could just talk a bill to death and a bill would never get voted on, especially if that bill had majority support. Now, okay, so what prevented senators from talking bills to death beyond this expectation? And part of it was that the Senate workload was relatively minimal back in the 1800s and prior to the Civil War. You didn't have the full-time Congress that we have today. Instead, you had a part-time legislature that met periodically, and then most of the time they weren't even around Washington, D.C. It wasn't until after the Civil War that you got a more professionalized legislature. However, obstructionism did increase beginning in the 1880s. In other words, this practice of using different procedural tools to prevent something from passing, if you will, or to prevent business from getting done, if you want to think about it that way. Now, leaders tried to ban the filibuster during this time period and tried to ban talking a bill indefinitely and talking a bill to death. But leaders ultimately weren't successful in doing so. And so cloture, to limit unlimited debate, if you will, was created at then President Wilson's request in 1917. And we remember 1917, that was the time of World War I and the US entrance into World War I on behalf of the British and the French and the Allies. And this was framed as a matter of national security because you had a few senators who were obstructing business. And the way the cloture got put in was with a combination of very large scale public support and also widespread press coverage. And the initial rule that was set up was that 2/3 of all senators present and voting could vote to limit debate. So if you will, today we have it at 60. The initial rule was at 2/3. But what we're going to see with the filibuster is that the filibuster itself has changed quite a bit over time. And this was set at, and so why 2/3? So it was set at 2/3 as a compromise because you had a minority of senators who wanted even more radical reforms to the Senate. And there was a majority that didn't want nearly as radical a reform, so the compromise was made, okay, 2/3. Now, as I mentioned, the filibuster has changed quite a bit over time. And this is an important note, and I'll mention the punchline here and then revisit the punchline later, and that is this. Rules are not something that are so sticky to where they can't be changed. It may feel that way sometimes, and it may seemingly be that way sometimes, but the fact is rules can change and rules do change. And so with the filibuster, we start off 1917. The filibuster was established, also known as Rule 22. In 1935, it was amended to where senators who yield twice for a quorum call, while the same question is before the Senate, lose control over the floor. So in other words, it's this idea to where senators can't keep yielding the floor to other people indefinitely to prevent a vote from taking place. And we go to 1948, 1949, which are somewhat contradictory but nonetheless, there's a point in the middle of the contradiction. So 1948, cloture cannot be applied to procedural motions to take up legislation. So a procedural motion to take up legislation would be, for example, somebody moves to consider X bill. 1949, the Senate votes to prohibit application of cloture to procedural motions. And so here what we have here is we have a contradiction 1 year apart. And so the important thing to note here is that rules can be changed in a very short time period to be very different than what they were. We go to 1949, and we have two amendments. Cloture was raised to 2/3 of the entire Senate membership, and that cloture can be applied to procedural motions, except motions to consider changes to Senate rules. We go 1959, goes back to what it was originally. Cloture lowered to 2/3 of senators present and voting, and that cloture can be applied to motions to consider changes to Senate rules. We go to 1975, which is where many Congress scholars cite as the beginning of the modern Congress that we see today. And the reason why 1975 is because there were lots of internal rules changes in both the House and the Senate to establish the rest of what would become ultimately the modern Congress that we see today. And so let's talk about some of the stuff on the Senate side. So you had a couple amendments to the rules. One of them is that cloture was lowered from 2/3 down to 3/5 of the Senate's membership. And also 2/3 of senators present and voting for motions to consider changes in Senate rules. And so 1979, that it capped post-cloture debate. So once cloture is invoked to limit debate, it's at 100 hours. 1989, that 100 hours gets cut down to 30 hours before a vote has to take place. Now we go to the nuclear option. And so in 2013, through a parliamentarian's ruling in the Senate and a vote subsequently that took place after that, executive branch appointments other than the Supreme Court were not subject to the filibuster. And so this was done under then Senator Harry Reid. We go 4 years later, and we have a partisan changeover to Republican control of the Senate. And so in 2017, when Neil Gorsuch was nominated for the Supreme Court, then Majority Leader Mitch McConnell expanded out this precedent under the nuclear option to include executive branch appointments, including the Supreme Court, not being subject to the filibuster. And so this was done initially specifically to get Neil Gorsuch onto the court. And so why do I walk through some of the brief history here? Well, one reason is to show that rules change over time. A second reason why is because the Constitution does not mention the filibuster at all. So, okay, so why can the Senate make a rule like this to begin with? Well, we go to Article 1 of the Constitution. And under Article 1 of the Constitution, each chamber, i.e. the House or Senate, is empowered to make their own rules, to run their own internal proceedings. Ergo, this is how you get very different histories with respect to how the House has evolved and how the Senate has evolved, including, say, the filibuster that we talk about here. So, okay, how's the filibuster been used? So, number one usage, to kill bills or to force amendments to bills. So, I cited some statistics earlier. I'll go ahead and recite those here. 57.92%, or nearly 58%, from 1901 to 2004 were done to kill a bill. 26.35% of filibusters during this time period were done to get a bill amended. Also, the filibuster has been used disproportionately on civil rights legislation relative to other policy areas. So if you take a look at, say, how the filibuster's been used, and you look at the policy areas of the different bills on which it's been used, civil rights legislation predominates relative to other policy areas. And so from 1901 to 2004, it was used 31 times. And so what were the outcome out of those 31 times? Well, 14 out of 31 times, the bill died. 8 times, the bill ended up passing. What about the remaining times? So what about the other 9 times? The other 9 times, you got a combination of some compromises that were reached to overcome the filibuster, and then the compromised version of the bill passed. Other times, because some of the bills dealt with, say, funding for varying civil rights initiatives, funding got reduced, and then the bill passed. And then there was one instance, where a bill got scheduled to vote, but I don't know whether a vote actually took place on that. And that wasn't entirely clear from the data that I took a look at from Greg Koger. Also, the use of the filibusters got used more frequently as the Senate's workload has expanded. So as the Senate considered more bills, and as the Senate had more to do, the use of the filibuster did get more frequent. Also, it got more frequent as party polarization increased. And also, it gets used sometimes for specific senators to accomplish other policy goals. And so sometimes what will happen is that senators will threaten to, or will filibuster a bill, but they're not really opposed necessarily to that bill, but rather what they're trying to do is they're trying to use a particular bill as leverage to get the bill that they really want passed and through the legislative process. In addition, the filibuster gets used more as the cost of filibustering decreases. And so what do I mean here by the cost of filibuster? Well, we'll contrast a couple of different eras of the Senate. We'll go back to the 1950s. If somebody wanted to filibuster a bill in the 1950s, they had to stand up and start talking and keep talking and talking and talking for as long as they physically could, until such time as they could yield the floor to somebody else who ostensibly would pick up right where they left off. And so the Senate then would be in continuous session until the filibuster broke. Now that's pretty costly for the person doing so. Let's compare that to, say, what happens today with the filibuster. So today, a senator indicates to their respective party leader that they intend to filibuster a bill, and they've usually lined up before they indicate that intent to do so. Oh, by the way, I've got support of more than 40 senators. And so what happens functionally in many cases is that, okay, the bill is considered to be filibustered, and then the Senate moves on to other legislation. And so you don't have, say, people standing up or anything like that. And so as a result, the cost, if you will, to a senator for filibustering ends up decreasing. And if you have a highly polarized political environment like you have today, if anything, senators from certain states can be rewarded by their electorate for having filibustered. And it happens more as the Senate has more time to meet. And so what's happened with the Senate over time as they've had more to do is that they met on more days and they've had more days in session. And so let's talk about some implications of the filibuster. So let's say we had a world where there was no filibuster in the Senate. And if there was a world in which there was no filibuster in the Senate, for a bill to become law, it'd have to pass the House with a majority of support. It'd have to pass the Senate with a majority of support. And yes, I realize I'm grossly oversimplifying the legislative process to make a broader point here. And so it would also have to be either signed by the president, or if vetoed by the president, overcome by a 2/3 vote of each the House and the Senate. And so all to say, if you shift the pivotal member in the Senate from that 60th member to that 51st member, all of a sudden there's a set of legislation that can now pass that otherwise wouldn't have gotten as far as getting a vote. And so consequently, because say you get a decrease in legislative output simply because you increase the threshold for a bill to pass, you get some difficulty in passing legislation, especially when you consider the preferences of the median House member and you consider the preferences of the president. And so right now we see any number of bills that currently end up falling right squarely in this area. Also, at times you have difficulty in legislating. And so if we want a modern example of that now, the over $3 trillion reform and social services package that Democrats are currently trying to pass, they're having a real difficult time getting agreement, say among members of the internal agreement among members of the House, as far as what exactly is going to be in that package, much less you go over to the Senate and trying to get a majority to agree there. And you've got two senators, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who are more moderate Democrats relative to, say, others in the Senate. And so consequently, you have to get agreement among majorities in both houses. And why majorities on that particular bill? Because the procedure is going to be used to circumvent the filibuster called budget reconciliation, which is where you can pass budget items a very limited number of times a year through a procedure known as budget reconciliation, where you don't have the pivotal member at 60, you have that pivotal member at 51, if you will. Now, the difficulty in legislating is circumvented somewhat by what's called omnibus legislation. And so with omnibus legislation, you take a bunch of smaller measures and you put them into one giant bill. And then you promptly pass that giant bill. A great example of this actually is the Affordable Care Act, where under the Affordable Care Act, not only did you have, say, healthcare considered, but you also had student loans, that is subsidized and unsubsidized, where the sole lender would be the federal government. And you also had some limitations with respect to what the interest rates were going to be. And so you had different policy ideas that were compiled into one giant bill, and then that giant bill gets passed. Now, this also has implications for the filibuster, also has implications for civil rights legislation, simply because it's been used quite frequently on civil rights legislation and disproportionately relative to legislation in other policy areas. And so here's looking at, say, things like police reform at the federal level, as well as other things. And so what are some reform proposals to the filibuster? Well, one proposal is just get rid of it. And instead of, say, putting the pivotal member at the 60th member, it's just majority vote, put it right at 50, right at 51, and be done with it that way. Another proposal is to make filibustering more costly. Because if the cost argument is right, and I think it is, then if you make filibustering more costly, then you should get less filibustering, all else held equal. And so President Biden, who served in the Senate for a long time, his idea is to restore the standing filibuster. In other words, if a senator is going to filibuster, they need to go on the floor and they need to start talking and and have the filibuster that way. And the argument would go then that you would start to see filibustering go down a bit, simply because members have to be much more committed to doing so. Now, another way to do so is to increase the political cost of those filibustering. So what if, for example, the media turned on senators who decided to obstruct legislation all the time and to obstruct bills? Another proposal is to insist on decorum in debate. And so what I mean by insisting on decorum in debate is the same as what Greg Koger means in his book on that. And on the last slide, I'll put up the sites to his book, as well as a couple of other books that I've consulted here, including Sarah Bender and Steve Smith's book. Which, if there's a single book to read on the filibuster, that would be the one. And so insisting on decorum in debate quite simply is this: if a member is not debating on a bill, but solely decides to keep talking and talking and talking about all kinds of unrelated matters, then declare that person in violation of Senate rules because they're not following decorum in debate. And if they're declared and found in violation of Senate rules, then they have to sit this particular bill out. And that would make filibustering then a lot more costly for those members who decide to engage in it. So another option is, okay, you can change the cloture pivot, because it was 2/3 when it got set up. Now it's 60. What if you set it to some lower number, like say 55 or 53? So if you change that pivot closer to the majority, then you'll see less filibustering, simply because there's a higher bar for one to be able to successfully filibuster. Now, another idea, and a variant of this idea, is a proposal by Sarah Bender and Steve Smith on the back end of their book. And their proposal is basically to have staged cloture pivots. So that way you could still have debate in the Senate, but at the same time, you'll eventually get to a vote. So how would that work? All right, so the first time somebody filibusters, okay, the first cloture pivot would be, say, 60, and that would last for X time. Then it would go down to, say, 55. That would last for X time. Then it would go down and eventually converge to a majority, such that you still get debate, but at the same time, you eventually get toward a vote on legislation. Another proposal is to expand the set of legislation that can't be filibustered. Now, if we think about it, we have a variant of this already in effect with the nuclear option, right? Where with the nuclear option, you have executive branch appointments, including Supreme Court nominations, that can't be filibustered. What if you extend that to other policy areas, like, say, for example, civil rights, or say, for example, defense policy, or other policy areas? So if you expand the set of legislation that can't be filibustered, you'll see less filibustering, simply because there's less places where people can filibuster. Also, prohibit filibusters that occur late in the session. And so oftentimes in legislatures, on the back end of the session, before the legislators go off and campaign for re-election, you usually have a fair bit of business that they're trying to get through. And so if you have a late session filibuster, what that does is it prevents a lot of that business from getting done that would otherwise get done. And so if you prohibit late session filibusters, it still allows for things to get done, but at the same time can also allow for debate to take place in earlier stages. Also, put a time limit between a cloture filing and a vote taking place. And so if you put a time limit there, that means there's a limit on debate before a vote takes place. And so those are some ideas that scholars have proposed. And so let me talk about 3 different additional resources, all written by people who, I will freely confess, have forgotten more than I will ever know about the filibuster or about congressional procedure for that matter. So the first book is a fantastic book by Sarah Bender and Steve Smith. Politics of Principle, Filibustering in the United States Senate. This is the single definitive historical resource on the filibuster. And this is the book, so to speak. And I drew upon this book fairly significantly in terms of how I put together this talk. A second book that followed up on this was a book by Greg Koger about filibustering. And a third book, and this is the book where I talk about, say, the pivotal member and shifts in the pivotal member. This is some work by a political scientist, Keith Crable, who wrote a book called Pivotal Politics, talking about what happens when, say, you shift pivots to different places with respect to, say, what happens with legislation. And so with that, I'll go ahead, stop my screen share. And I'll go ahead and say thank you to everybody for listening. And thank you very much for coming. And I hope you found this talk useful. I hope you found it informative, and I welcome your questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
What would it take to change the rules? Would it take the same 60 vote margin to pass legislation, or would it just take a majority to change the rules?
Well, depends on when you did it and how you did it. Is the short answer. And so you can so at the beginning of each 2-year legislative session, or at the beginning of each Congress, if you will, one of the first votes that takes place beyond, say, the election of officers is the adoption of the rules. And so in the Senate, the rules state that to change rules from one to the next has to be done by, and I believe, the 2/3 mark. But at the same time, if you want to change at any other time after that, what can happen is a series of parliamentary motions where you can, say, propose a rules change. You don't quite have 2/3, so okay, the rules change gets voted down, so to speak. And I'll use voted down in air quotes here. And then you challenge the ruling of the parliamentarian, and the parliamentarian says, okay, this is voted down per the Senate rules, and okay, appeal that parliamentarian's ruling to the chair. And then at that point, the Senate votes whether to accept the parliamentarian's ruling, and that's done based on a majority vote. And if the parliamentarian's ruling is not accepted, then you can change the rules based on majority vote. And so that's why I say depends on how you do this.
I had a question about the omnibus bills.
Uh-huh.
You've cleared up a little bit. I've always been really confused about why they put all these different things together. I couldn't figure that out. So you're saying part of that is to circumvent filibusters then?
It can be done that way, especially, say, with budget bills and using the budget reconciliation procedure, as is being proposed currently for the $3+ trillion package.
Mm-hmm.
Though I will add, we'll see what the final number is after the negotiating said and done.
Mm-hmm.
But also part of why omnibus legislation gets used is as part of legislative bargaining. And so you think about legislative bargaining, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a bill passed. And if you include, say, one thing over here that, okay, has a collection of people supporting it, but at the same time, you can get a few more people to support that if you put this other thing over here in as part of the package, and you put together this giant collection, if you will, that if carefully crafted, you can end up getting majorities to get a bunch of things passed, including some things that may not necessarily pass if voted on their own.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I've got one other question while we're at the reconciliation. You say anything can be done by reconciliation if there's a budget connection to it? Is that it? What
So
can
it
be done
has-
through reconciliation?
Okay, so what can be done through reconciliation is anything that has to be substantially budget related. It doesn't have to be exclusively budget related. And in fact, there was a ruling on the $3+ trillion package that in its present form, it would not be allowed to be considered under the budget reconciliation because it had too many rules changes and too many policy changes relative to the spending components. And so what's happening now is that package is being rewritten in a way to where some of the rules and potential policy changes are getting taken out of the package to be considered elsewhere. So that way the remainder will end up being allowed to be considered as under the reconciliation procedure.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah. And as far as say where that line is exactly, as far as, okay, how much budget versus how much rules and everything, ultimately that's the decision of the Senate parliamentarian, but it does have to substantially be budget related.
Mhm.
And substantially here is somewhat in the eye of the beholder.
Okay. Yeah, I had a question. One of the changes that you talked about was expand the legislation that can't be filibustered. And that sounded interesting, but to make those rule changes, you would have to have a simple majority or a supermajority.
Ultimately, you could enact that if you did it at the beginning. You'd need more than a majority. If say you did it subsequently and appealed the ruling of the chair and went through some of the parliamentary motions, then you could do so by a majority vote.
Okay. And where do you, an unrelated question, where do you think the voting rights bills are in relation to the filibuster?
I would say that those are, say with voting rights and police reform to talk about too, those would fit squarely in that between 51 and 60 mark. As far as say, and because it would fit say within that range, that's why it would be filibuster. That's why it would be filibustered if it came to that.
Okay.
You mean, you think it would have between 51 and 60 votes? Is that what you're saying?
At least 50, at least 51 on that, and that would vary a little bit depending on what exact variant went up for a vote. And because it sits say in the 51 to 60 range, probably most likely closer to 51, depending on say what some of the specifics are. As a result, with the filibuster pivot being currently at 60, that's part of what makes it, if you will, filibusterable. All right, so Lynn, I see that you're speaking and you got the mute button on.
There, yeah. And maybe I had to step away, so maybe you hit on this, where since you no longer have to talk, all you have to have is one person that doesn't want to support it, and he hasn't have to do anything, so he can just like, nah, I'm not going to do it, and that constitutes now what used to be the standing filibuster. It's just like, no, I don't think so, and I guess it's kind of like a pocket filibuster type thing.
Provided that person has 39 others.
Okay, so he still has to have the support.
Yeah, still has to have the support of more than 40.
Okay.
So as long as they have that. However, there's a separate procedure, what's called the Senate hold procedure, which operates much more like what it is you've talked about. So if one person wants to say no, then what would often happen is they would place a hold on a bill,
Yeah, okay.
and you would have, say, anonymous holds and things like that. And the whole procedure got so out of hand at one point to where there was a reform put through to actually limit how much senators could do holds on bills. Make no mistake, they can do it a lot. And the original purpose of the hold procedure was, say, for example, if a senator had a death in the family or something like that, to where they had to leave Washington, D.C. immediately for a temporary purpose, then come back to be able to vote on something, they could ask, okay, can we have a temporary hold on this? But at the same time, as you can imagine, say, with in the era of high levels of polarization, as polarization goes up, incentives to use different procedural tools to alternatively obstruct legislation if you don't want something passed, or to pass legislation if you do, the use of those, the incentives to use those procedural tools increases.
Okay. With this that's coming up with a vote on the raising the debt ceiling and passing of the budget, do they ever use the filibuster? I mean, that's simply, we just aren't going to support you and vote, and we don't have to worry about a filibuster because we have more than enough people who won't vote to support that.
So in the case of, say, the debt ceiling and the budget bill, in that case, that's what's going to go through budget reconciliation, where you don't have to say have to get to that 60 point.
Okay.
Or instead, you can just pass by a majority and be done.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Well, if nobody else has one, I'll ask another one. So in this Post-Dispatch, Josh Hawley has been quoted as saying that he will hold up different appointments if he can't have his way. Now, how can he hold up? Can one person hold up an executive appointment?
Yes, no, and kind of. So here's why I say that. No, in the sense that we go back to what I talked about earlier. Once that appointment gets to the floor, then it's not subject to a filibuster, right?
Okay.
But at the same time, there's a whole lot of stages in say the appointment process before things get that far.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, I'll use, say, federal appeals court judges as an example here. And so the president nominates a federal appeals court judge, somebody to be a federal appeals court judge. After they're nominated, there's an FBI background check that's run. And the results of that FBI background check are eventually made available to the Senate. And so once you get past that period, then at that point, the nominee meets with different senators. Mostly from the president's party, but at the same time, some from the other political party, from the opposing political party as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point in there, you have committee hearings. And sometimes these committee hearings are pretty quick. Other times they're not. And so sometimes in that process, say, for example, if something is found out about a nominee, whatever that something might be, sometimes the hearing gets delayed. So that way the issue is more fully vetted. And if it looks like the nominee looks like there's not going to be enough votes for the nominee, then it's privately communicated over to the president. Look, you nominated this person, we don't have support. Can you consider pulling this nomination? And 9 times out of 10, the president does, or the nominee is told and the nominee withdraws. And so all to say, for an individual senator, there are a number of different opportunities for an individual senator especially if, say, they have group support, to elongate the process if they're so inclined to do so. And that's especially so if, for example, you have a majority of the Senate from the opposing political party of the president.
Mhm.
And in that situation, then you really have opportunities. And we saw a little bit of that play out several years back under the last couple of years of Barack Obama's presidency,
Mhm.
where you had federal judge confirmations slow to a snail's pace at best. And so all to say, yes, individual senators can do different things, but once those nominations get to the floor, it becomes a lot harder for them to do a whole lot at that point.
Mhm. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I've got one more question,
Huh?
sort of a question. It seems like I remember under the previous administration, when the Republicans had the majority in the Senate,
Mhm.
there were some bills that Mitch McConnell just would not bring to the floor. Does he have that power arbitrarily not to block a bill on his own from being considered?
So the short answer is the majority leader can do quite a bit to prevent a bill from being considered, because the majority leader has substantial say over the scheduling of bills on the floor. And so this is a practice where say Mitch McConnell, will use him for example, where he behaves a lot more like House speakers traditionally have, especially say in the 1975 on Congress, where basically they won't put a bill to a vote unless they're going to be on the winning side of that vote. And that happens quite frequently in the House. And that's happening more and more in the Senate, and didn't necessarily used to happen with the prevalence that it does now, but it definitely does happen now.
It certainly gives us a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It does.
So what hope do you have for Congress becoming more, I don't know what to say, workable, more, making it work more? Because right
Well-
now it's not working very well with the polarization in the last 10 years.
Right. And as far as long-term hope, I do have hope that Congress can function more than it does today, because this country has been through periods where things have been highly polarized. And we go back to, say, the time period, the last time we were this polarized as a country, you go back to about the 1890s to early 1900s. And did the polarization eventually break? Yes, it did. In part with the advent of World War I. And also in part with some other structural changes in American politics that occurred around that time as well. Now I will say, I hope it doesn't come to war of any kind to have to say break some of the polarization.
What else do you see as breaking the polarization?
Well, another thing that, and I will go ahead go to say some group psychology evidence some say psychology of groups evidence. And that is there can be some events that end up rallying people together in ways that people normally wouldn't rally together. And usually those are pretty large scale, really significant events. Sometimes it can also take a slow but collective realization as a society that this is not a good functional state of affairs for democratic governance over the long run. And there is some evidence that this is starting to happen, but it's gonna take a while for that to really take hold, so to speak, barring, say, any large scale significant event, so to speak.
Do you think the frame of reference or the lack of frame of reference that some of the senators and representatives have in terms of the way things, I'll say, used to be, and that they've not experienced a lot of stuff, does that, along with the social media and the I'll use disinformation, that combined has made things a lot more difficult because nobody seems to know what reality is anymore? I mean, is that all that snowballing into some of those preventative?
I think it does a bit. And also let me throw out another hypothesis here. So Sean Theriault wrote a book called The Gingrich Senators.
Okay.
And so his book on the Gingrich Senators, the baseline premise is this. And admittedly, it's been a couple of years since I've read it. So the baseline premise is that you had many people who were in the House at the time Newt Gingrich became Speaker in 1995. And that some of those same people who were in the House at around that time ended up shortly thereafter getting elected to the Senate and brought with them all of the norms that got internalized into the House right into the Senate. And so an example of one of the Gingrich senators who is still there, Lindsey Graham, because he started off as a House member around the time Gingrich became Speaker. And then later got elected to the Senate, and Lindsey Graham is still there. Admittedly, there are fewer of the Gingrich senators who are there now 25 plus years later, but there are still some who are there. And what Theriault argues is that with those Gingrich senators going from the House to the Senate, they brought their norms with them, and also they subsequently influenced a generation of senators with those norms. And so what Theriault argues is that, if you follow the argument all the way through, is that that's the beginning of the beginning of substantial polarization in the Senate that ended the Senate as was once commonly understood.
Because he's the one that, when he was in Gingrich in the House, he was the one that told all the people to go back to their districts, don't stay during the summer, because when they were off session, they would get to know each other as people rather than opponents. And then when it was, at least this is when I was working in DC, this is what I was told, that they went home and nobody understands the other as a colleague. They become mortal enemies more so than colleagues.
Right. And so another explanation that goes with that, to transliterate that right into the Senate, is there was a PBS special, I want to say in the 1980s, early 1990s, what was called the Tuesday to Thursday Club. And where with the Tuesday to Thursday Club, it's basically this, where members of Congress are in Washington, D.C. doing the standard legislative business from Tuesday to Thursday. once things are done, close the business Thursday. On the last flight out Thursday night or the first flight out Friday morning, they're flying back to their districts or to their home states. And they stay in their districts or home states until Monday, and then come on back Monday, and so begins the process again. And in the process of doing so, you have a point here where members of Congress don't necessarily have as much of an incentive to work across party lines with one another, because in part they don't know each other as much as people. And so, in fact, that's one of the factors that's cited for why you have higher levels of filibuster activity, because of the emergence of the Tuesday to Thursday club.
I'm assuming there's a balance between getting a district and understanding what your constituents want or need versus the beltway mentality, which is what's always been accused of. And so there's a fine balance, but that's what I assume the big breaks were for, rather than and constant communication with your constituents and having that kind of input. You don't have to necessarily be physically in your district to get that if you have an appropriate office mechanism.
Right. And part of that, if you will, to build upon that, is on the House side, there's a constant campaign.
Mhm.
The House members are continually campaigning for re-election, because remember, election day is always less than 2 years away. And so what that really incentivizes, if you will, especially on the House side, but you're also starting to see it on the Senate side to lesser degrees, is basically constant focus of media attention, constantly going and raising money, and constantly, say, that being back and forth between, say, constituents and DC, with, if anything, slightly more of an eye toward constituents than necessarily legislative service. Though I will say there is that continual pull for members between constituent and legislative service that's always been there. However, for senators, you see some of those same effects in the first 2 years of their term and the last 2 years of their term. And then a little bit of a lull in the intervening 2 years. Where in the first 2 years of a senator's terms, what they will do is very much constituent stuff, but also a practice that Tracy Sulkin, who wrote a book by the same name called Issue Uptake, where they'll take up some of the issues that their challenger brought up in the previous election, in part as an effort to preempt future challengers on that same issue or that same set of issues. Then you have about the middle 2 years, and then you've got the last 2 years where you're right back to re-election, so to speak.
Another Gingrich type you're talking about was John McCain. And it was always my impression that John McCain swayed Lindsey Graham, kept him under wraps, as it were. Not entirely, but as we know, he did just before he died. So I don't think that's helped, the polarization that is taking place the last couple of years. Lindsey Graham seems to have gone off kilter, whatever. Anyway.
And so with that, and so you bring up a point here, and I'll go ahead take the point and make it broader than, say, the two senators you're talking about. And that is this idea of replacing senators. And so what's happened in the Senate, much as in the House, and where, if you really want to see this, you can take a look at state legislatures, where what's happened is that, say, for example, if you have, and I'll use Iowa as an example of this. So in Iowa, for many years, you had two senators who were one of whom was one of the more liberal people in the US Senate in Tom Harkin, and also one of the more conservative people in the Senate in Chuck Grassley. Now, Tom Harkin decides not to run for re-election. He's replaced with Johnny Ernst. And so you have a liberal replaced with a conservative. And so you have some other states where you've had, say, for example, conservatives replaced with liberals.
The Veterans Court.
And so as such, as a result of this replacement, you do get polarization simply because of the replacement hypothesis.
Gotcha.
Well, you started out telling us about the book on Gingrich, or the Gingrich senator, the book anyway. So he described what happened. Is this ever going to come to an end then?
The answer is it eventually will. As far as what it will take, time will tell. Hopefully it will be a collective realization that governance cannot continue in some of the ways that it has gone indefinitely. But at the same time, sometimes sharp divisions in societies are ended with, say, fairly significant large-scale events.
So if California falls into the ocean and the whole East Coast is flooded, then maybe that'll be significant enough for them to kind of to figure out they need to get off their seats and work together.
Quite like, say, events say of that type of magnitude, quite possibly, especially if they occurred suddenly.
Hmm. Okay. Are there any other questions? No?
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you for spending part of your Tuesday evening with us. It's
Yeah,
informative.
yeah, of course. And thank you all so much for having me out. And I thank you all for being a very engaged audience, but also asking some really smart questions and some really, really well-informed questions. And I also am thankful that you all are interested in American politics and interested in the state of American politics. And for that, not only say as a political scientist, but also as a citizen, for that, I'm grateful.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
For all of you who are interested in learning about the legislation that was signed by Governor Pritzker, I guess last Tuesday, the Sierra Club Speaker Series, which will take place on October 12th. It's a Zoom presentation at 6. There's going to be a presentation by Sally Brussels to try to help us know in Metro East what we can do positively to help move the ideas and the policies that are built into this legislation. So if you're interested, hope you are, go to the Class Palisades Group Sierra Club website. Not right now. It hasn't put up yet, but in about 4 or 5 days, we'll have an ad in the local media where you can go to the Sierra Club Class Palisades Group website and go to events and go to the calendar and register. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for our visitors for joining us. And hopefully you will join us for some more of our programs. So, good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, Mrs. Margaret Troy, wherever you are.